Hi, welcome back. In our last session, we were able to create different views for our mini portfolio applications. We created a user interface for seeing all the projects that have been submitted, and we created a page for a form that allows us to add projects, to edit an existing project, or even to delete it. Now, throughout the session, we discovered and we created a lot of routes to have access to all these different pages. What I am going to start doing today, because we could not finish it in the last session, is really to look at our validation mechanism, because if you remember well, we were taking the inputs as they were entered last time in the form that we created, but we never really checked whether this input is valid or not. We did some basic validation that is provided to us on the client side, so on the HTML side of things, and these were provided by Bootstrap, but we never really did any form of validation on the server side. So maybe today we will spend a little bit of time to finish what we've started last time, and talk about validation a little bit. In the next part of today's video, we are going to look at how Calligraphy provides us with a mechanism to allow users, or to allow the audience to log in and log out. So it's an authentication mechanism that would give them the permission to publish their own projects as well. Okay, so this is a little bit what we're gonna try to do today. Now, the whole idea of creating this authentication mechanism is not necessarily to come up with a robust application. This is not the point, at least not for this course. But we definitely do want to give you the basics so that you know that Calligraphy and this particular framework comes pre-packaged with a way for you to validate and to authenticate and authorize, even in some situation, users based on certain credentials that they provide. So without further ado, let's get to our lecture. The main section we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to mention validation a little bit. So we'll go through that, and then after we finish the validation, we will talk and we will get into the authentication. Okay, so as far as the validation is concerned, Calligraphy comes pre-packaged with a third-party tool called GUMP, which, if you want to know more about GUMP, you can go ahead. There is a reference given to you in the lecture reference, so in the documentation, and you can feel free to go and read about it. The part that we're concerned with is really the validation piece, and really Calligraphy comes pre-packaged with some methods that you can immediately use that can help you do the validation on the spot, and these methods are also explained in the reference. So let's go ahead and open our code and go directly to the controller, because really where the validation is going to happen is where we read the parameters coming from the user. And so far in the application that we created, if you remember well, we have two methods. We have the add project method, and then we have the update project method, and both of them do read input from our users. And in these two places, we are going to add some validation to the input that we receive. So how do we do this? Now, if you remember well the flow of the code, so at first we associate to the model and to the database table that we're going to read from, and then there is this statement that says $parameters, which reads the parameters from the request, and then we have a file parameter that reads the file. So at this stage, now we have all the input coming from the user. So this is the perfect location to say that now we need to validate. So it's over here that we're gonna have input validation. Okay, let's add it like that as a comment for the time being, and let's see how we're going to do this. So really the validation happens this way. We're going to create a variable, call it validate, and the controller comes pre-packaged with with an integrated object called validator, and that object validator has a method called check. Okay, and this is really the method that's going to call the GUMP library. And what this method takes, it takes the array of parameters that you want to check, and in our case it's really parameters. Okay, and then we're going to define the rules that we're going to check these parameters against. So what are these rules? And these rules are really the way we provide them to GUMP. We provide it to them. We provide them in a collection, in an array, more specifically. And in there, we're going to identify which attributes or which parameters we want to check. So, for example, we want to check title because we have a parameter called title. Great, but now we need to define the rules that title needs to have. And these rules, if I go back to the documentation, is really what these validators over here are. So you have things like, is it a required field, what is its maximum length, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in our case, obviously the title is a required field. Okay, so we do this, we say it's required, and then we separate it by these bars to add another rule. And the other rule that we want to add, we want to say that its maximum length, max underscore len, L-E-N, we want it to be 18. And notice how I separate it with a comma. So that's our first attribute. Our second attribute that we want to test against is really description or short description or category. We don't need to check category at this stage, I don't think, because down the road category is something that would be more interesting if it's done in an enumeration, so they're predefined values. So let's not check for it. Let's check for a short description, and similarly to title, we also want it to be required. And then it also does have a max length, which I believe we set it to 200 in the case of short description. And then we have a description, which really is our long description. And then again, it is a required field, and I believe we set the max length to be, I think it did not have a max length, so let's get rid of that one. All we need to do is say that it's a required field. And now let's talk about our image URL, okay? Because we do have a file, and that file is image URL, and we need to check whether it's a valid file. Now, on the UI side, we already did specify that we can only accept images, but in this particular case, let's do a double check just in case. We got some some hacker who had a little bit of time on his or her hand to work on our code. So in our case, what we need to do, we're going to say it's a required file because we are requiring the file. So the way to say it, it's like this. We say it's a required file. That's the way GUMP does it. And then we're going to say we do have a restriction on the extension of the file. And the possibilities are we want it to be a PNG, or we want it to be a JPG, that stands for JPEG, or we want it to be a GIF. And there's sometimes another way for JPEG to have an extension, which would be JPEG, and then potentially SVG. Okay, I'm just adding some potential URLs over here. Okay, and that ideally should cover it for us. Now we did, I think, put that the category is a required field. So how about we just say validate that it's also required. Okay, and we'll have that. So this will do the check. Now after the validation is done, the way GUMP is going to act, it's always going to return something to us, okay? And it will, if everything goes well, then it's going to return a true and it's going to proceed. But if things don't go well and it finds errors, then in that case it's going to return invalid inputs, okay? So now how do we validate if the validate variable did return inputs to us? And the way to do it, we need to do if validate, which is the name of our variable, is not true. But not only is it not true, it should be of the same it should be of a different type as well. So if you remember well, over here we're checking that it's not true, but we need to verify whether it has an array that got returned. So that doesn't mean that if it's not true, it's a false. It might not be a boolean, and what it's returning is really an array, and that is when we wanna get these values. So what do we do in that case? And what we're gonna do, we are going to return our view. Okay, and what is our view? Our view is really the add project form, which we happen to put it in. Let me go back here. It should be in showcase add. So we are going to do and get showcase add. Okay, but now in this particular case, we are going to return a bunch of inputs for our view. One of them is this error error variable that we added last time, which is a boolean, which is gonna be able to display our messaging component within the form. So this is exactly what this one is going to help us do. And now that error messaging, or the messaging component, does need a bunch of parameters. One of the parameters is the status. Well, the messaging component does need a status to say whether it's an error or a success message or an information message or a warning message. And in Bootstrap, that status, if we want it to be an error, is usually called danger. So we are going to send it as a danger. And then it takes a message header that we can set the way we want. So it really is a text. So maybe over here, let's say whoops, something like that. Something went wrong. Okay, I'm just inventing stuff over here, but you get the point. Then it does need a message as well. So let me add a message as well, and that message in this particular case, it's the generic message that we want to appear on top of the form. Okay, this has nothing to do yet with where the error occurred, but rather it's about the messaging on the page itself. So this should be generic, and what we could say is some of the inputs are invalid. Okay, make sure all the required inputs are entered properly, or have been entered properly, something along those lines. Okay, this is a generic message. Now, what else do we need? If you remember well, we also do want this ability to indicate where in the form the error occurred, and we already prepared ourselves in our view last time, and I will go back to show it to you in the code. So we do have kind of a variable array that is called error, and that errors like that is really going to be the array that GUMP would return to us, because what GUMP is going to return every time there's an error, it's going to return the name of the field along with the error message, which is great for us. So this is exactly what we're going to be using. We're going to send validate to it. Okay. So far it seems to be working just fine. Now, do we need a poster at this stage? Yes. A poster. Do we need to send the project variables? I would say yes. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Since we're fetching the parameters, I am going to send back as a project. We are going to send back the parameters, just like that. Okay. Let's see. Is the project the project is an array? That is right. So maybe what we need is we need to specify. Let me just think it through a little bit. Yes. Okay. So let me show you this. So over here we're getting a bunch of parameters coming from the user. What I am going to suggest that we do, since this is going to be an array, so what I am going to add here, let's add something called user input, which is going to turn this array into an object that our view can consume. Now, by turning it into an object, then we could use in the view, and let me show you. We could use it like a terminology like that. Since we already established it this way, we don't want to change it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast. This is called casting. Casting is when you switch an object to another. Okay. Now since the parameters is an array and it is an object, or a type of object, what I want to do here is I want to switch that array into an object of type generic object, okay, and that would help me call it the way I would like to call it. So let me do this. So this is our user input, and this is exactly what we are going to send to our view. We are going to send it in an object way of writing, so that the view can consume it in a good way. All right, so now with that, I believe we are almost ready. I would just like to add an exit over here to avoid that the code continues after this whenever the error occurs. All we're going to do is we're going to send back the view. Okay, now let me go back a little bit to the pug in order for us to see how all of these items are going to be consumed. So when I go to add.pug, let's look at the code. The first one that we stumble upon is if there is an error, which is one of the flags that we put, so we set it to true, then we're going to include the messaging framework. Great. Now, let me take you to the messaging framework. If you look at the messaging framework, it's going to need the status, which in our case we did send danger. That is fantastic. And it does need a message header, which we already sent. Here's the status again, and it needs a message. And we sent all three of them. So this is going to be work just fine, I believe. Great. Let's now continue. Here's an example of an error that is contextual to the attribute that caused it. So what this is going to say is if there is an array called errors that has an element called title, that means the title did generate an error, then what I am going to do is I'm going to output that message that comes with the array, which is great. That is exactly what GUMP gives us. So now I go back to my project controller. All these, we just define them in the controller itself. So now ideally, if we go to our browser and we do localhost /showcase/new, I am gonna get my form. Great, so far it seems to be okay. Now, in order for us to test this, since we already introduced some bootstrap mechanisms that would, not allow us to submit unless we filled the required fields, what we're going to do in the controller, we're going to try and fake a little bit over here and say, just for the sake of it, that the title can only be alphanumeric. Okay, so what I'm going to add, I'm going to add alpha, meaning it cannot be numeric, and I'm gonna fake our error just to display it to you guys by adding a numeric value in here. So let's go to our browser again, and I am gonna do test 6, and ideally, since it has a numeric value, it should return an error for us. So let's do test, let's do test, let's do test, and then I'm gonna add just any file for us to look at, and let's do this one over here. If things are okay, this should not pass. Crossing fingers, and here we go. It did not pass. And look at the beauty. Not only it gave me the message that I want on top, but it also gave me this message, which is returned by GUMP, that says the title field may only contain letters. Okay, now I don't know if you noticed, but it also made this red. That means it is detecting an error as if image URL has not been entered. So let's go back a little bit to the code, and really, if you look at this, image URL is not coming from parameters. Okay, it's coming from file. So the way to go around this is really to say and to set parameters image URL. So we're going to act on the parameters that come from the user, and we're going to set this one to file. just to make sure that if there is an input here, so that dollar parameters inherit, it takes that input, so we assign it to whatever comes to file, and then since the validator is going on to parameters and checking all the parameters that are contained within the parameters array, then in that case it will read the image file the way we want it. Okay. And this is just a small tweak. Otherwise, you're going to have to create two validators, which could be a little overkill in this particular case. So let's take a look at this. And now it seems to be okay. All right. So let me just double check. If I do, I'm going to add another PNG here and do a save. Ideally, we're going to have the same file. Now the file is disappearing. This is somehow easier to change by making sure that that our view reads the image URL taken from the parameters. Okay, so I'm not that much worried about that part. Now that this is done, we are going to do exactly the same thing on the update side, except we don't have to worry about the image in this particular case, because when we're updating, we're not allowing users to change the image, at least for the purpose of this course. So now what we're going to do is, once we read the parameters, so once we are inside that project, we are going to do exactly the same thing. Okay, and this should be the same, and we're going to get rid of image because we're not validating that, and we'll have the same, it's the same form anyways, and maybe what we need to do, if you remember well, there is a distinction between the add form and the delete form, and we need to set the value of put like that. We need to set it to true. Okay. All right, and now this should do it. Let me just go check page controller, I believe it was, and where, okay, we send the project and we send the put. And here we go. Now let's go and check in edit function. In order for us to do this, let's go back to our showcase. Those are some of the projects. I might have cleaned them up a little bit. So let's go to test 36. Now notice there's already a value in here. So ideally, if our system is working fine, now when I try to save it again, it's going to tell me you can't because it has numerics in it. And here we go. But we have another problem which we will fix. So we got our error, but that problem, let's see what that is. It might be a variable that is not defined somewhere. Let's see. $user input. Yes, indeed. We never really defined it, so we forgot that part. We need to say that our user input is parameters. Okay, just like that. We're going to send this. Now, I think this should be just fine. And here we go. If you remember, I told you that we need to make this an object. Why? Because we want to be able to read the values, the wrong values that we entered. Otherwise, these will be empty, and the user has to type all over again. Okay, so this is really the reason why we have it this way. And here we go. This gives us a little bit of how validation works. Now there are lots of rules that are provided with GUMP. You can go ahead and read them all. When you start taking, valid email, for example, can be very useful. Validating phone numbers, address, credit card numbers, and so on and so forth. These can be extremely useful. So that is really just what the validation is about. Great. Now let's go back to our code. There's a little bit of cleanup that we need to do in the web.php. Last time we created these routes. These are really the routes that our application needs. The ones that we created before were kind of mimicking a little bit the create, the delete, and the edit using a get. So now we no longer need those. So we need to make sure to get rid of them. Okay, and all this is really in preparation for the authentication mechanism. Now let's get to our second part, and let's talk about authentication and how authentication is done in Caligraphy. And we're mainly going to talk about the one that comes out of the box because it would make things a lot easier for us. So let's go back to our outline, to our course outline, and go for lecture 11. All right, and the way really to do this. Since we used already the table users, so the table user from authentication, we created it together last time. All we need to do, if you look at web.php, is activate authentication, which by default is commented for us. So we are gonna remove the comments from this and activate it. And if you notice that authentication over here uses the model user with the table users, which is exactly the one that we use to create our user table. So we are good when it gets to that. A second piece that we need to do is we need to activate all the routes that help us create, register people and have a login screen. You can go ahead and create them manually. These are nothing but regular forms, just like all the others. But Caligraphy comes out of the box with some forms created for you, and these can be found in views under authentication. You have a login form and a register form. If you go to the login form, you will notice it looks pretty much like the login form that we, like the forms that we created, okay? But in this case, it has a username and a password. And in the case of the register, it has username, password, and confirm password, okay? And then these two, what they're gonna do is they're gonna be calling authentication controller at a particular point. So that means there is another controller that is provided out of the box for us, and you can find it in here. It's under auth as well. It's called authentication controller, and this is where all the brain for the authentication mechanism is. So in there you have an index function similarly to what we usually do. You have another one that gives you access to the registration form. We have one that's called home, which by default would, I would explain it to you when we get to it. Then you have this registration mechanism, which is nothing more but adding a user to the database table with all the validation needed. And then you have a login mechanism or a login logic that validates if the entered password is the same as the one stored in the database, okay? And otherwise it would return errors for you. So it's not doing anything magical that you cannot create on your own, but at least it gives us something to use out of the box. So let's go ahead and remove the comments from this. And the way to access each one of those is if we do localhost/login, it should be able to take us to the login screen. We also have one that is a logout, which would immediately log you out. Register takes us to the registration form, and so on and so forth. So let's give it a shot. So now, ideally, if I do showcase/login, I should get to a login form. Is that what's happening? Great. I get, by default, the Caligraphy login, and we already have a user in the database that we created last time. Would be good to go back and check that out and maybe add more users if we want to. So let's see, I think we called it like test user something. We are going to showcase, and we're going to look at our user. So passcode is 1234, and then our test user is test user 1. Okay, now this is not going to work, and the reason for that is because for protection reasons, the module that comes out of the box with Caligraphy, what it's going to do is it's going to encode the password for you. So you will never be able to see the password of a user in the database. It will be encoded, and Caligraphy provides you with some mechanisms to do some encoding, so you would never be able to do this. So whatever we do here is just not going to work anymore because the password will not work properly. So what we're going to do is, instead of logging in, we're going to go ahead and sign up and create a new user directly from these forms, and we'll see how this reflects on the database. So let's do this. Call it test1, and the passcode is 1234. And then we'll confirm it again, 234, and we're going to sign up. Okay, this ideally signed us up. Let's go ahead and see if we added a user. Yes, we did. So notice it's test1, and then it's this passcode that you don't know what it is. It's an encoded value, which is the equivalent of the 1, 2, 3, 4. So now if I go ahead and do test1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going to take me to some page that Caligraphy created for us, which is called home. So really, home is our logged in page. Great. Okay. It's just a form of a redirection. So now we need to organize ourselves and organize our application in a way that that kind of mimics this, and we need to figure out what sections of or what routes of our application are not going to be permitted for people to use. Okay, and here comes the magic. So let's go and check initially what we really want to do. So let's go back to our index. Here we go. So we want everybody to see the projects. Let's do that. So this is a public page. Okay, everybody can have access to it. Maybe what we want is when people click on one of these, all right, they're not going to be able to do it. They're going to have to log in. Okay, so our home really technically is our either our edit page or our add page, and both of them, they result to the form that we created, and both of them are handled in page controller. So maybe what we want is that the page controller over here, which is called showcase form, we want to add a guard to it. Okay, first of all, this is our home, and we need to add a guard. So what is a guard? A guard is something that's going to tell our page or that's going to tell our controller that you cannot access this function because you do not have permission for it. And that might be the only thing that we need. So how do we do this? What we need is, before we even give access to projects in this page, we need to validate if the user is logged in. So how do we do this? There is a function, and we'll go to the documentation, because this is where you're gonna find it in a very good way. There is a set of methods that we can use. One of them is user, or one of them is authorized. So maybe everything that we need to do is, if this user is authorized, then we're going to show them the page. If they're not authorized, then we're going to redirect them to home, to the index page, or to the login page. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to check if authorized, just like that. And actually what we want to check is if it's not. If not authorized, then we are going to redirect to login. And maybe this should do it, and then we're going to exit. Okay? Else, we'll do the rest. Just like that. Now let's go see what happened. Let's go to our public page. Can we access it? Yes. Great. Can we hit here? Yes, we can. So it did not work. If not authorized, redirect to login. So let's try something out over here. Are we logged in? Maybe we are logged in. Yes, indeed, maybe we are, because we did log in. So maybe what we need to do, log out first. Let's log out. Great, we went back to this. Now let's do this again. Now we're sure we're logged out. Let's try it. And it's taking us to the login page. Okay, we just did it. So now let's try it. Test 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. Now it's going to log me back in, take me to the index. Well, now we need to fix this, but ideally it will take me to the index, and then from the index I click. Now I'm logged in, and I'll be able to do it. Let's try that again. I'm going to log out. I'm going to try to do a new form. Okay, let me go here. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and hack the system and say I want to do new. No, 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 no. You can't. You have to be logged in. Okay, so now let's go back and fix our routes just to make sure and our redirects, because what we need to do is we need to make sure that to define what home is, because right now it's not. And what we want to do is we have two ways, but I would suggest that we do this. So what is going to be our home? Basically, after we log in, where do we want to take people? That's really what the idea of home is. So it's either we call this home and we get rid of this. Okay, and notice that this absolutely needs to be the first route. Okay, it must be the first route. So let's try it out. Let's do this. It worked. Let's click here. It worked. Let's do test 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. And ideally this should take me back to the list of all the projects. And here we go. We just did it. And notice how now this is called home. What's the difference between this and this? It's nothing. It just indicates when I am in home, it indicates to me that I can take these actions. So now when I click in here, I know that I can make changes. So let's see that our changes work. We're going to say Youppi. Can only contain letters. Yes, of course. Let's do it. Let's see actually if it might not allow me to have a dash. Okay, so let's say just call it UP. And voila. All right. So this is really how authentication works. Now you have several other methods to use. So we used authorized, but if you, for whatever reason, need to have information about the user, then you can use the user method. So let me walk you through it, and maybe what we could do is the following. So if you are authorized, instead of taking you to the project, let's play around a little bit with these methods. So let me dump users, and you're gonna see how you can have access to all the user information that you need, which you could use that well if needed. So things like the username in our case and things like that. So let's try that again. Here we go. So test 1, the passcode, of course, it's going to be embedded, the permissions, and so on. So this is what user does for us. Let's go now and check what authorized and unauthorized. What they do is, if for whatever reason you want to log the user out, but in a sense you don't want to authorize them without necessarily clearing the session, then you would use this function. If for whatever reason you want to switch users, then you would use authorize and you switch them to another user. This is a great functionality. You could also use the logout function if for whatever reason after you finish a route or a controller action or a task, you want to immediately log them out, you could go ahead and use that. And then there is something else that is built in Caligraphy, which we touched upon a little bit. There is a column in the user that is given that is called permissions. So this is like this is like a leveling that you leveling for users. So you might want to give certain permissions to some people but not to others. So you could use this column for that purpose by setting up different tiers of permissions. So if you are a tier 0, maybe you're only allowed to view the project. If you're tier 1, we allow you both to view it and to edit them, but maybe we don't allow you to add. Maybe if we add another permission called 2 and we put 2, then in that case we allow you to add more projects. So we could play around with them, and the fact that it's an integer, can give you enough flexibility to add as many tiers as you want. So once you have these permissions set up, you can use something called the guard function. What the guard function is going to do is going to do all the check for you, and it's going to make sure that the user has the permission to access. So let me show you how this would work. Let's go back to our page controller over here, and now instead of using if authorized, what I am going to use is I'm going to use the guard. The guard will return either we will check what it returns. I will show you, but we will use it instead of using if authorized. So let's go and do dump guard. Okay, and what guard takes, it needs it needs you to tell it what the name of the column that handles permission is called in the database. Why? Because you might choose to call it something else. Okay, so this is really nothing more but a string that's going to say, it's called, in our case, it's called permissions, like that. Okay, and the next value is what is the accepted permission to enter, to allow it to enter this. So let's say we're only going to accept people who have permission 1 to enter this route, to enter this controller, I mean. Okay, and the third parameter that you would want to give it, where do I take them in case this is not, this is not the what's it called, it's not allowed. Then in that case we need to take them back to the login URL. What is the login URL in our case? It is this. Okay, so this is what this function is going to do for us. So all you need to do really is, even without dumping or without anything, you're gonna just execute this function, because what it's gonna do is it's gonna check if the permission is allowed. If it's not allowed, it's gonna send them back to login, and it will never execute anything that's underneath. So now let's go and take a look. We have a user with permission 1, but we can't use them. So let's test 1, and ideally now test 1 is no longer allowed to use the function. Do I still have a dump? No, I don't have a dump. So now if I do enter, we have a problem. Okay, we'll go fix it very quickly. On line 11, we have an extra parentheses. Sorry for that. Okay, now let's refresh. Ideally, it should not let me go in if I hit this. Okay, notice that it's taking you to a random place right now. It's not. I'm hitting home, but it's not allowing me to go to the edit function, so it's kicking me out of it, which is exactly, really, if you think about it, what we want. So maybe what we do, let's do this. We're going to send them back to index. Okay. Here's exactly what's happening. So if I take them back to login, or I take them back to index, this is a permission thing. So now the user is authorized. Okay, so this is why it's allowing it to look at the public the public page, but it's not allowing them to edit. It's taking them back to login. But when you get to the login page, it's checking that the user is logged in, so it's taking them back to the index. So ideally here we should create another page that tells them, sorry, you do not have permission to enter this. Okay, and that should do it. All right. Great. So now we learned different functions and different ways to do different things. Okay, the guard can become very powerful when you have when you want to when you want to create some what we call the function access profiles or function access permissions, where for each group of users you only want to give permissions or privileges to do certain things but not others. Okay, this is when the guard can become very powerful for you. All right, so this almost covers it. Going back to the documentation, we have seen almost all the methods that can be applied to the authentication. Now, if I were to go back a little bit to the code, nothing restricts you to use the login and the register forms that are given to you, or the controller that is given to you. All this can be rewritten if you are comfortable enough to write yours. What Caligraphy ends up giving you is a set of methods that are useful to you, but then you can customize it to the way you want. And here we go. We actually created our own mini portfolio application. Okay, if you can repeat these steps and recreate this whole application, and I will guarantee that if you understand the concepts well, it will not take you more than 20 minutes to recreate the whole thing. Okay, which is tremendous. Now in the next sessions, we're going to learn about some further out-of-the-box functionalities that come with, or features rather, that come out of the box with Caligraphy, and the more you get a hang of these features, the more it's going to make development even more exciting for you guys. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. You have a fantastic day.